Welcome to the Murder in 20 podcast, where I, Bobby Stevens, am your host with a new episode every Wednesday. If you're a serious fan of true crime and love listening to podcasts but don't want all that small talk, you've come to the right place. We get right to the facts. Murder in 20 episodes are concise and complete in 20 minutes. Less talk and more true crime. Every episode is free on our website at murderin20.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and YouTube. Also learn about upcoming episodes on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. To support Murder in 20, feel free to leave a 5-star review on any one of them, or all of them. We're not shy. And we couldn't do this podcast without all our sources, which we acknowledge throughout the podcast and are listed on our website. Thanks for tuning in. Now let's get to this week's episode. The Johnson family should have been home from their summer vacation by now. It was late August in 1982, and it was time to get their 2 young daughters ready for school. But instead, the family was missing. Bob Johnson and his wife Jackie and their daughters Karen and Janet, who were 11 and 13, had loaded up their car with camping gear and left their home in Kelowna, in British Columbia, Canada, or BC as it's known, to travel to Red Deer, Alberta and visit with friends. Then they were meeting up with Jackie's parents, George and Edith Bentley, who had left their home in Port Coquitlam, BC, with their truck and camper, and the 6 of them were going to do some family camping in Wells Grey Provincial Park, which is located about 350 miles northeast of Vancouver, on the edge of the border between BC and Alberta. It contains over 1 million acres of pristine wilderness, with lush old-growth rainforests, cascading waterfalls, and snow-capped mountains. Nowadays, over 35,000 campers visit it every year. In the early 1980s, it was likely just a few thousand, and the Johnson and Bentley families were among those campers. On August 23rd, Bob's friend and co-worker, Alan Bonar, returned from his vacation to the lumber mill they both worked at in Kelowna and discovered Bob hadn't returned from his vacation. Alan knew Bob should have been back August 16th, and it wasn't like him to miss work, so Alan contacted the police and they issued a tourist alert. Bob's twin sister Elaine Woods told the province newspaper that we feel there has to be something gone wrong. It's very unusual that Bob hasn't contacted anybody in the family or at the mill. The media in 1982 was served by small-town local newspapers and 2 big city newspapers out of Vancouver, the Province and the Vancouver Sun. Local TV stations throughout BC carried the story of the 3 missing generations. I was living in Kelowna at the time and remember how the entire city followed the media every day, reading the newspapers and watching the 6 o'clock news. Everyone was hoping the families were just lost and would soon be found safe. Police held off on starting ground and air searches as they didn't know for certain what area the Johnson and Bentleys had traveled to, or if they'd even met up. Wells Grey Park was a vast wilderness. Soon a news report came in about a tip from a gas station worker in 150 Mile House, a small town about 60 miles east of Wells Grey Park. He thought he'd served the family's gas on August 15th and that they'd asked directions to a back road. Police investigated the tip, but it didn't lead anywhere. Then police learned that park officials had a record of the Bentleys in Wells Grey Park on August 3rd, but a contract labor dispute between workers and the provincial government meant no records were kept after that date. Police began planning to launch an air search near the small town of Clearwater, which is near the Wells Grey Park. They were looking for any signs of stranded tents, the Johnsons' 1979 beige Caravel car with a luggage rack on the roof, and the Bentley's new 1981 red and silver Ford pickup with a camper and aluminum boat. Since retiring, the Bentleys spent much of their time traveling, camping throughout BC. Due to George's health, they would keep in touch with the family. They hadn't made contact with them since July 27th, and the family was worried. And friends of the Bentleys said they would listen to the news on the radio as they traveled, and if they'd heard the news reports, they would have called if they could. Something was definitely wrong. Finally, the police air search got off the ground. Using 3 planes and with the help from civilians, they searched for the 6 family members. Unfortunately, the air search didn't turn up any sightings of the car, truck, camper, or the families. Corporal Jim Shaw of the Kelowna Police said there were fears that the 6 could already be dead. Soon a new tip came in from another gas station worker saying Bob and his daughters had asked about a good area for berry picking, and that he'd also asked directions for a road near Chase. That's about 60 miles south of Clearwater. The Bentleys were experienced campers who didn't like crowds and would choose secluded spots, so it was possible that the 2 families were camping somewhere off the beaten path. The Bentleys were well prepared and known to carry a rifle in their truck. The widespread media coverage had also prompted the Bentley's daughter in Vancouver to recall that her mother had made a collect phone call to her on August 6. Then on September 4th, police received a new tip that all 6 family members had been seen at a camping spot in Wells Grey Park almost 3 weeks earlier on August 15th. Another gas station attendant was adamant he saw the families together, this time in 100 Mile House. By the first weekend in September, the search area had grown to 20,000 square miles. There was very little to go on and few clues coming in, and no new leads or sightings of the vehicles. Police expanded their search to the waters of the North Thompson River, south of Clearwater, but it didn't produce any clues. On September 12th, Keith Morgan, crime reporter for the Province newspaper, reported that RCMP Superintendent Scotty Gardner wondered, did they go over an embankment? But there would have been physical evidence of some type. Maybe it was foul play. It's gruesome, but we can't rule it out. However, the killers would have had to drive the vehicles away and gas them up. And he asked, where are the vehicles? That was a very good question. A day later, on September 13th, a short statement was released to the media that the Johnsons' car may have been found, and that there are no bodies, alive or dead, just a car. Within just a day, that headline would change. There now appeared to be 6 bodies in the burned-out car. Police had received a tip from an Abbotsford man who had been picking berries at Battle Mountain, 17 miles from Clearwater, when he spotted the burned-out car. It appeared to have been pushed off a rugged road, 30 feet down on an embankment, and set on fire. It was found in an area that had been previously searched, but with the car torched, it was well camouflaged by the dense brush and old-growth forest, which made it very difficult to spot. Police believe the 6 family members were already dead when the car was set on fire. The police weren't sure what type of accelerant had been used. The gas cap was still on the gas tank. The fire had burned so hot the windows and taillights melted. Tim Padmore from the Vancouver Sun would describe the scene as, a trail of violence leads to a scorched, rust-smeared car body. The tomb of 6 persons believed to be members of 2 BC families missing since early August. A granite boulder is scarred by a car's undercarriage, a clump of grass torn up by a tire, a small pine tree uprooted, and at the end of the trail was the devastated remains of the 1979 Plymouth Caravel. The car had come to rest in a muddy depression, straddling several fallen trees. A white rooftop carrier vanished in the flames, but its contents did not. Sitting on the roof were 2 rows of brown bottles, fused by the heat so the necks collapsed inside. There were a couple of cans on the roof emptied by flames. A set of rusty keys dangled from the trunk lock. There was no rear license plate showing, and on the seats were their remains. Police examined the trail and terrain and found the rocks were undisturbed. It appeared the car had been purposely and carefully driven there, but no one in the area recalled seeing the Johnsons' car or the Bentley's truck and camper. A pathologist was flown to the site and determined the remains were 4 adults and 2 children. The Vancouver Sun reported that in the back seat was a tangle of bones, lumps of charred flesh, and bits of hair. There would be pieces of skull, perhaps a fragment of rib nearby. From the positions of the larger bones, we had a relatively good idea which body they belonged to, but identifying the smaller bones and fragments was largely guesswork. Nearly all of the bones were severely damaged by heat, and some would crumble when touched. The body parts were put in white plastic bags. Foot parts would go in one bag, and upper torso went into another. Each small bag was labeled. Then the small bags were placed into the larger bags. There was 1 large bag for each body, and in the end, there were 6. Police believed all 6 victims were dead before the car was driven to the trail and pushed down the embankment and set on fire. However, the coroner and Kamloops offered a different opinion and said it's possible some were alive when the fire was started. They may have been rendered unconscious and piled in the back of the car. It's not at all certain they were dead before the fire. A large flatbed truck was brought in to remove the Johnsons' burned-out car. The truck tires were wrapped in chains so it could make it through the dense bush. Using the large crane on the back deck of the truck, the car was lifted from its deep depression in the mud. Photos in the Calgary Herald newspaper show the car loaded onto the truck's deck. Its rear wheels melted down to the metal rims. the trunk closed and the front license plate still attached to the bumper. Once the car was removed from the bush, it was placed inside a trailer and transported to a lab for examination. No camping equipment had been found inside the burned-out car or its trunk. RCMP Inspector Vic Edwards was optimistic they'd find the murder scene a short distance from the car. He said the victim's last campsite in Wells Grey Park could be their death scene. The thorough examination of the remains would take weeks and involve dentists, doctors, anthropologists, chemists, and physicists. X-rays showed metal fragments of zippers and snap fasteners. Some were thought to be bullet fragments. Police released information that one of the 6 victims found in the back seat of the car had been shot in the head. A reward was established for information leading to the killer or killers. 140 of Bob's co-workers at the mill donated a day's pay and raised over $16,000. Then the owners of the mill matched their donation. Then the public joined in and the reward reached over $43,000. That was a large sum of money in 1982. Police lacked a motive for the murders and clues were scarce. Relatives of the families told police that they were known to carry large amounts of cash as they didn't like to use credit cards. And theories bounced around, such as maybe it was a botched robbery, or they'd come across a marijuana growing operation in the bush, or they'd returned from berry picking and found thieves in their camp and a confrontation occurred. A few days after the car was found, the public would hear from Kurt Crack, the Abbotsford man who discovered the burnt-out car. He traveled to Wells Grey Park and was picking berries when he spotted it. He ran across some horseback riders and told them about the car, but they were unable to find it. Then they told police, who sent Parks employees to locate it, and they couldn't find it either. Then on September 2nd, Kurt tried to report the car to the Abbotsford police, but the dispatcher who took his call told him to call Clearwater Police directly. Now, if you remember in the early 1980s, long-distance calls were expensive, so Kurt didn't make the phone call. He was upset they expected him to pay for it. So there's conflicting reports as to how Kurt and police eventually connected, but 11 days later, on September 13th, Kurt's directions finally led police straight to the Johnsons' car. Meanwhile, in early September, the police in North Battleford, Saskatchewan, a small town 650 miles east of the Wells Grey Park, received a tip that the Bentley's truck and camper had been spotted and was being driven by 2 Frenchmen with accents. Police released composite drawings of the 2 men. One was 5'9", 150 pounds with shoulder-length blonde hair. The other was 6 foot, 200 pounds with black hair. By September 25th, police had received 500 tips. On September 24th, a memorial service was held for Bob Johnson, his wife Jackie, and their daughters Janet and Karen. It was at the St. Paul's United Church in Kelowna, the same church that Bob and Jackie were married in 21 years earlier. Bob's boss and friend Ross Gorman delivered the eulogy and said, "We have come here today to show our deep love for this family." 400 people attended the service. Many were Bob's co-workers who had worked an early shift so they could pay their respects. 4 days later, on September 28th, a memorial service was held for George and Edith Bentley at the United Church in Surrey. 150 people came together to mourn the loss of a couple that had been married 36 years. The next day, on September 29th, the passenger on the 3 p.m. ferry sailing from Vancouver to Victoria spotted 2 French men that resembled the police sketch. She reported it to the chief steward, who alerted the captain. A second passenger, a bus driver, also reported seeing the 2 men. With over 500 passengers on the ferry, they didn't want to lose sight of the men, so a ferry employee changed out of her uniform into civilian clothing, and along with another employee stayed close to the 2 men and discreetly kept an eye on them. When the ferry docked, police were waiting. They questioned the 2 men for 24 hours, but they were eventually cleared. A couple weeks later, in mid-October, police questioned 2 men in Edmonton about the grisly murders, but they too were cleared and released. By the end of October, 1,400 tips had rolled in. Police had gone through 700 of them and had 10 men working full-time on the case. The sketches of the 2 French men had sparked hundreds of new tips. In the first week of November, police in Clearwater were conducting door-to-door questioning the community. Telephone lines were set up for anonymous tips, which now grew to 1,800. Police were hoping someone, somewhere, would have the key to solving the murders. 3 months after the 6 Johnson and Bentley family members had been reported missing, snow had started to fall in Wells Grey Park, and police by now had received 4,000 tips. The coroner had positively identified 3 of the bodies: grandfather George, his daughter Jackie, and granddaughter Janet. There was a tentative identification on his second granddaughter Karen. The coroner was unable to positively identify Edith and her son-in-law Bob. Police came up with the idea to find a similar truck, camper, and boat and drive it across Canada to jog people's memories. A car dealer in Kamloops supplied the truck, and a camper and a boat were added. Large signs were placed on the side of the truck and on the back door in both English and French, in large letters that read, "The Johnson and Bentley murders in Wells Grey Park," and asked, "Have you seen a truck and camper similar to this since August 1982? If so, phone your local police." 6 months later, in May 1983, a half-hour TV documentary aired about the unsolved murders. In Kelowna, we were all glued to our TV screens. The truck, camper, and boat replica left Kamloops and began making its way across Canada, heading to Ontario and Quebec. The trip was timed to coincide with summer camping season, and police were hoping it would bring new leads. And by May 13th, police had received 118 new tips. One particular tip looked promising, saying that the truck and camper had been spotted in Quebec. Police investigated, but none of the tips panned out, and soon the truck and camper headed back to BC. 5 months later, on October 18th, forestry workers discovered the Bentley's burned-out truck and camper. It turned out to be less than 20 miles from where the Johnsons' burned-out car had been found 11 months earlier. Like the car, it was burned and camouflaged by the dense bush. This time a large helicopter was brought in to lift the burned wreckage onto the bed of a flatbed truck and was driven to Vancouver for forensic examination. Police immediately began canvassing the Clearwater community door to door asking for information. Their big break would come when they spoke to Ross Coburn, who told them about being in a vehicle driven by his friend David Shearing in 1980 who struck a man while walking on the road. They both fled the scene and never reported the hit and run, and the man died from his injuries. Police were able to locate David Shearing in nearby Dawson Creek and use this new information to question him. During their 10 hours of questioning, David surprisingly brought up the Johnson and Bentley murders, and by the end of the interview, confessed to killing them. On November 21st, police finally made an arrest. David Shearing was charged with 1 count of second-degree murder in the death of Edith Bentley. He was only 23 when he became a mass murderer. Local residents were shocked that someone who lived amongst them was a killer. David was said to be a shy, timid man. His brother was a sheriff, and his father had been a prison guard. David lived with his mother just over a mile away from the murder scene. Police searched his home and found the murder weapon hanging on the wall, a .22 caliber automatic rifle. In his bedroom, they would also find a tape recorder and camera that he'd taken from the families. The Bentley's aluminum boat and motor was found on property not far from the murder site. David claimed he spotted the truck and camper on his way home from work on August 1st. Later, he went back, crept through the dark woods, and spied on the family. He then returned the next evening to stalk them and to kill them. He wanted their boat and motor. He shot the adults first while they were sitting around the campfire. He then shot the 2 girls who were sleeping in a tent nearby. He loaded the adults into the back of the car and the girls into the trunk and cleaned up the campsite. He drove the Johnsons' car to a hidden spot near his house, then went back to the campsite, put the camping gear in the camper, and drove it to where he'd parked the car. He returned the next night and set the car on fire by pouring gasoline inside and all around it. A few nights later, he drove the truck a few miles away and did the same thing. Police asked if he had an accomplice, and he told them no. The murder charges were quickly upgraded to 6 counts of second-degree murder. David Shearing waived his right to a preliminary hearing and pled guilty to all 6 murders. While waiting for sentencing, Chief Investigator Mike Eastham had a feeling David wasn't telling the whole truth, and he wanted the truth on record for future parole hearings, so he arranged a meeting with David. A book written by lead investigator Mike Eastham and author Ian MacLeod called The Seventh Shadow describes Mike's interview with the killer, in which the truth finally came out. In David Shearing's words, "I got it in my mind that I wanted them. I knew I was going to have to kill those other 4 to get the girls. He says the kids were in the tent, and either Edith or Jackie saw him first. Then Bob stood up and caught the killer slugging in their throat. He toppled, gurgling. Then the older guy started running back over the truck, and I shot him next to the passenger side door. Now I know you're probably thinking what I'm thinking, that he was likely running for the rifle he kept in the truck. And if he'd only made it, things might have turned out different. David continues, the mother of the girls was running for the tent, and I shot her in the head about halfway between it and the fire. Then I headed around to get the older woman who was trying to get in the camper. I just came up behind her and shot her in the head too. Then I went over to the tent and crawled in. He then states he had to crawl back out to shoot the younger guy again because making all this noise. He confessed that he kept the girls alive for 6 days, sexually assaulting them before eventually killing them. He said he took Karen for a walk on a trail and distracted her, and when she turned around and looked away, he took the .22 that he stashed earlier and shot her in the back of the head. He said he did the same thing to her older sister Janet the next day. He then loaded their bodies into the trunk of the car and went home to bed. The next morning, he drove the car with the 6 dead bodies deeper into the bush, poured 5 gallons of fuel inside, and lit a match. On April 17, 1984, David Shearing was sentenced to 6 concurrent terms of life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. This was the first time in BC's history that the maximum sentence for second-degree murder was handed out. Evil had erupted in BC. David Shearing did not appeal his conviction or his sentence. In 2008, he came up for parole, but the board denied him. And in 2012, they denied him again. He has since withdrawn from requesting parole. As of this recording, he has spent 36 years in prison and is 61 years old. The alarming thing about the Johnson and Bentley murders is that they could still happen today. Thousands of people camp every year, and yes, we now all have cell phones, but in vast remote areas like the Wells Grey Provincial Park, there may not be cell service, and if a murderer is intent on stalking and killing someone, their unsuspecting victim may not have a chance to survive. On a personal note, I was genuinely touched by these murders. Growing up in Kelowna when the Johnson and Bentley families disappeared, our community rallied in the hopes that they were just lost in the bush and would be found safe. But the evil truth that emerged forever changed our community, our city, our province, and our country. Our innocence was lost. But we resolved to not let evil win, and we vowed to never forget them. In 1988, the Johnson and Bentley Memorial Aquatic Center in West Kelowna was built in their memory and still stands today. Thanks for listening to Murder in 20 with less talk and more true crime. Be sure to tune in next Wednesday for the episode of teenager Tyler Hadley, who at 17 wanted to throw a party, but he had to get rid of his parents first. He posted a party invite on Facebook, then killed them with a claw hammer, hid their bodies in the bedroom, and threw a party to die for. We'd like to acknowledge Purple Planet for use of their music and our many editorial sources who are listed on our website. If you're dying to hear more, past episodes of Murder in 20 are available for free at murderin20.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and YouTube. And every week we announce upcoming episodes on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Until then, stay safe, sleep with the lights on, and don't play with strangers.